There are four main abdominal muscles to consider when our goal is to get a bigger and thicker six-pack. So, rectus abdominis, and this is separated by a central fibrous structure called the linea alba, therefore resulting in the left and right muscle belly. The rectus abdominis is the primary flexor of the spine, and it also functions to stabilize the spine via co-contraction of the erector spinae, or however you want to say it, through increasing joint stiffness. And the external, internal, oblique, and the transverse abdominis function as great spinal stabilizers, and Dane et al. In 2007 reported that these muscles function to provide mechanical stability to the spine by contracting against the intra-abdominal pressure of the abdominals. The muscle thickness of the abdominals is generally greater in males compared to females, and this is especially in the internal oblique. When it comes to muscle fiber type, very little data exists, to be honest. However, the abdominals do appear to display a mixed proportion of type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, with type 1 muscle fibers ranging in between 55 to 58 across the rectus abdominis, internal and external oblique muscles. However, one thing I have to mention is that there are genetic differences here. So you might have 60% of type 1 muscle fibers and I might have 40% of type 1 muscle fibers. However, that said, probably training with a mixture of both lighter and heavier loads is probably more beneficial for muscle growth. So moving on to probably the most important part of the video, and which exercises you should or maybe shouldn't be doing, let's move on to electromyography, or electromyography, however you want to say it. Or you probably would have heard of it as EMG activity. Now, one thing I have to mention is that let's see this as a rough indicator. Let's not see it as a direct indicator for muscle growth and which exercises are 100% the best for you. So what EMG really is that it just represents an activity to the extent to which individual motor units within the muscle are active during a joint action. So in non-fatigue muscles, the extent to which motor units are active really determines the amount of tensile force that is produced, and obviously that will lead to greater mechanical loading, and it's thought to be one of the primary drivers for long-term muscular hypertrophy and adaptations. Let's face it, you've had someone in the gym tell you, bro, do squats, do deadlifts, and your abs will be fine, your abs will blow up. However, the science doesn't actually agree with this, as the science shows that rectus abdominis and external oblique muscle activity is only moderate. It's not very high at all, and there's actually no difference between the muscle activity during a squat or deadlift. In actual fact, there's actually higher activity during strongman lifts, like the strongman tire flip and lifting those massive atlas stones. What does the science say when it comes to compound exercises? Now, if we look at rectus abdominis muscle activity, Comfort et al. In 2011 explored the rectus abdominis muscle activity in both the back squat, front squat, and also the standing barbell overhead press with an absolute load of 40 kg, which might be a limitation there. However, Willis et al. In 2009 compared the back squat, conventional deadlift, barbell curl, and standing barbell press with 50 and 75% of the 1 rep max. Now, all that jargon out the way, they both reported that rectus abdominis muscle activity was superior in the overhead press compared to the back squat, deadlift, and the curl. Now, one thing I'll also mention is that some studies have also demonstrated that the standing overhead press actually also led to a lot more greater muscle activity in the serratus anterior, that slick looking muscle. Looking at the same study by Willis et al. In 2009, looking at external oblique activity this time, once again, they found that the standing barbell overhead press was more superior than a back squat, deadlift, and the curl. Looking at the comparison between compound and plank exercises, so rectus abdominis muscle activity again, looking at Asper et al. 2014, looking at the back squat and overhead squat, whereas Comfort et al. 2011, looking at back squat and front squat, and all of this, it came down to the front plank displaying superior rectus abdominis muscle activity compared to the back squat and the overhead squat. When looking at external oblique muscle activity, again in the same study by Asper et al. In 2014, They found that the front and side plank actually led to greater external oblique muscle activity than both the back squat and overhead squat. Comparing compound and trunk flexion exercises. Now, again in the same study looking at rectus abdominis muscle activity by Asper et al., they looked at the Swiss ball jackknife and the straight leg setup. They found that rectus abdominis and the external oblique muscle activity was higher in both the straight leg setup and the Swiss ball jackknife than the back squat or overhead squat. However, Hammerlin et al. In 2007 actually found that external oblique muscle activity was no different between the Superman prone trunk extension exercise compared to the back squat and the deadlift. So what about the effect of stability while doing ab exercises? Well, looking at the science, Mock et al. In 2014 assessed the muscle activity of the abdominals in a number of suspension exercises. What they found is that during a hip abduction plank, external oblique muscle activity was greater compared to the rectus abdominis muscle activity. There was also no difference between rectus abdominis muscle activity and the external oblique during the press up. All of this probably suggesting that suspension exercises is probably just fancy and it may not even be beneficial for training the abdominals. You might be wondering what the best upper body exercises are without doing direct ab work. Well, if you look at the majority of the studies, we can see that rectus abdominis and external oblique muscle activity appears to be higher during vertical pressing and pulling compared to horizontal pressing and pulling. Looking at sit-ups and curl-ups and adding external load. Well, Sternlicht et al. In 2003 compared a number of abdominal exercises compared to the traditional curl-up. They actually found that increased rectus abdominis muscle activity was greater when performing trunk flexion exercise with added elastic resistance, meaning that the greater the external resistance, which means the thicker the bands, it leads to greater rectus abdominis muscle activity and also external muscle activity, which is probably quite common sense. And something probably not so common sense is range of motion. Now, Anderson et al. In 1997 looked at the effect of joint range of motion, and he looked at sit-ups performed with trunk flexion, so at the lumbar spine, with sit-ups performed with hip flexion. What he found is that rectus abdominis muscle activity increased with increasing trunk flexion, but decreased with increasing hip flexion. So it might actually be a good idea by favoring the top portion of the trunk flexion sit-up, and these could also be called curl-ups or crunches, and also the bottom and middle portions of the hip flexion sit-up. So comparing different sit-up techniques, well, looking at the vast majority of research, it really appears that the rectus abdominis muscle activity is very similar between the curl-up and sit-up, whether the feet is anchored, unanchored, or the legs are straight or bent. Now, if you look at the external oblique muscle activity, it seems to be a bit higher in the sit-up compared to the curl-up, and this might possibly be due to the involvement of the hip flexion, which increases the external oblique muscle activity during the sit-up. So what about the mind-muscle connection or the effect of attentional focus? Now, to be honest with you, the research is a bit all over the place. Some studies will say yes, it leads to higher muscle activity, and other studies will show the opposite. Now, to be honest with you, I'll say just focus on our basics, probably adding external load and more sets and reps. And if you do enjoy having that mind-muscle connection, then sure, do it. So what are the best isolation exercises for the rectus abdominis, external oblique, and internal oblique according to the EMG research? Now, taking into account a lot of studies, we find that rectus abdominis muscle activity is higher when you perform the kneeling rollout, hanging leg raises, and in some cases even the reverse curl-up compared to the traditional sit-up and curl-up exercises. Now, looking at the external oblique muscle activity, it's a lot higher during a lot of the dynamic isolation exercises like the kneeling rollout, horizontal side bend, jackknife, and hanging leg raises, again compared to the sit-up and curl-up. Also, the rollout may be one of the most beneficial exercises for training the internal oblique. A lot of integrated core exercises and dynamic stabilization exercises are very commonly used for developing the abdominals. However, according to the science, only the plank with arm reach and side plank with arm reach can actually outperform the traditional curl-ups for rectus abdominis and external oblique muscle activity. And on that note, let's face it, unstable surfaces are very commonly used because, bro, it's functional, man. So like a Swiss ball or a Bosu ball. However, if you look at the EMG research, only the Swiss ball prone jackknife can really outperform the traditional curl-ups for rectus abdominis and external oblique muscle activity. And taking it a step further, let's look at the effect of the moment arm length. So a study done by Schoenfeld et al. In 2014 looked at different plank variations. What they found is that the long lever plank resulted in higher rectus abdominis and of course external oblique muscle activity compared to the standard plank variation without posterior pelvic tilt. However, that said, there was a trend towards higher rectus abdominis and external oblique muscle activity in the long lever plank with posterior pelvic tilt, which might surprise a lot of people. As well as this, McGill et al. In 2014 measured rectus abdominis muscle activity as well as of course external oblique muscle activity. What they actually found is that the hanging leg raise with extended legs led to higher muscle activity in both these muscles compared to your legs being bent. Now, this is probably not a surprise for most people. So coming towards the end of the video, I just want to highlight 3 key points that you need to know. Number 1, stating the obvious, is that diet is obviously very important to get six-pack abs. That's stating the obvious. If you don't have a good diet, you don't even know you're going to have abs. Number 2, genetics plays a massive part in fat distribution, whether you store a lot more fat during your lower abdominal area or upper abdominal area. In most people, it's probably the lower abdominal area, and also how thick your abs look. So you can do the best exercises in the world. However, if you don't have the best ab genetics, well, they're not going to get very thick. Number 3, EMG data. Like I said at the start of the video, it might not be the best indicator for muscle growth. Therefore, all of these exercises, use them as a guideline, not as a direct indicator, like I just said. Also, choose the exercises that you feel work best for you, and that's probably going to be my best recommendation. And as always, like I always say, if you want to use science to get jacked on a daily and just completely kick out this bro science, click the subscribe button down below, that red button, click the notification button next to it. But importantly, man, you know the deal. Stay positive, leave a comment, stay smiling, let's get it. And if you'd like to see another video like this, let me know. I'm out.